plants, all. So talking about from our seedless, non-vascular plants up to our angiosperms, they all have these 3 organs. Now, we're going to see that there are some additional organs that some plants have, but these all plants have, okay? And that's root, stems, and leaves, okay? And you guys are usually pretty familiar with these anyway, so this shouldn't be something you've never heard of before, so that's always nice. All right, so roots. We know that roots are coming out of the bottom side of the plant. They help to anchor the plant, meaning to give it a hold fast so it doesn't get knocked over, and to support the plant so it can be a way to kind of keep it from not just getting knocked over, but it can physically absorb some of the weight of the plant as it comes down from the stem into the ground. So it's the primary function of the roots is absorption of water and minerals, and we talked a minute ago how these can act as sinks. So you can see the roots of this here. I picked this one just because I think this is cool and it was something I got to see once upon a time. So in this hole is like a cave, and at the bottom of the cave, this is called a cenote. These are in like the Yucatan Peninsula, and at the bottom is a freshwater underground lake, basically. And so there are some plants where the roots actually extend down into this cave, and there's water down here that the roots grow down into. And so that the way the roots move has to do with some tropisms, which some you've heard of, and we'll talk about some more. But these are huge roots. You can see that there's a person here climbing them. That person is just a cool person. Anyhow, so roots. All right. When we look at the roots more up close, they are going to be composed of all of our tissue types. We've got vascular tissue, ground tissue, and dermal tissue. So in this diagram, in this cross section, these, what it calls surface cells, but we know we can call that dermal tissue. And so that's going to act as a protectant. It's not quite, it doesn't secrete the cuticle like we see in other parts of the plant, because we want water to come in. We don't want to block it out. And then we'll see that an outgrowth of that dermal tissue are going to be these things called root hairs. You can see some more of them here. What these do is they increase the surface area of the root, so there's more area that water can be absorbed. The ground tissue is going to be here, this kind of blue part throughout, and then this part here is going to be our vascular tissue. Okay, it's also sometimes called a vascular bundle, and so that's going to extend down. Within the root itself, a characteristic that roots have is they have this thing called a root cap. And what's happening here is it's again kind of like a callus. It's an area, so as the root grows downward, it's going to have stuff that could damage the tissue if it were more delicate. And so this root cap is there to just kind of protect the rest of the root. And then here, this is where it says area of dividing cells. This is what's called the meristem, or the apical meristem. And this is where mitosis is taking place. So meristem, mitosis, right? Dividing cells. So this is where the root's growing. This is called primary growth. So it's growing downward into the soil. And that division is going to occur here. So as the cells divide, you get more cells. It's going to cause the stem to grow downward and push against the root cap, and that's going to push the root downward. All right. There are different types of root systems. The main two types are what are called tap roots and fibrous roots. So a taproot system has essentially one big fat root that goes pretty deep, and you do have some roots that come off of this, but there's certainly this main root that's thicker than all the rest of them, and it grows straight down. One of the advantages of having a taproot is it can grow quickly and reach down to this lower level here relatively quickly, because it's not making as many of these side roots, fibrous roots. With a fibrous root system, they're all about the same width, and they don't have the advantage of being able to grow down really quickly, but they have the ability to spread out and access water in a wider area. So you could see there could be an advantage for either of those. All right, so now let's talk about stems. We talked about this idea of woody and herbaceous stems in our last video. So that's a difference that you should already know in terms of angiosperms. The function of a stem is to provide support. And for all plants, it's going to support leaves. And for angiosperms, it's going to also support flowers and fruits. But not all plants have those. Most of the vascular system of the plant is going to be housed within the stem. So whether it's an herbaceous stem like this one or a woody stem like this one, most of the vascular tissue is going to be in there. There's a lot of storage of water and of carbohydrates and lipids within the plant is in the stem. And we're going to see that for some plants, the stem is a place where, or the stem acts to help in reproduction, which is not in all plants, but in certain ones. So it's kind of a different function of the stem. All right, so I mentioned this word a minute ago, primary growth. So when we talk about plants growing, there are two ways that plants can grow. They can grow up and they can grow out. So primary growth is up and then down, really, if we're talking about stems, and then out is secondary growth. And one of the ways we can visualize that is when we look at tree rings. Now, this is a pretty complicated concept, like to really understand what these different levels are. We didn't even talk about this idea of Cambrium cells. But what I want you to take away from this is that what we see in those tree rings is this secondary growth. So as time goes by, the tree grows outward, and it does that by xylem layers growing toward the center and phloem layers growing out, and overall that pushes the width of the tree outward. And so we see that in rings. If you want to learn more about this, there's tons of information out there, but it can get pretty complicated and it's beyond what we need to know. But it is nice to think, okay, I can think about tree rings and understanding that's secondary growth as the plant moves outward. All right, now, there are some plants that have stems that are special, meaning that they don't necessarily do what we typically think of as the functionality of stems. An example of that are the stems of cacti. So cacti stems act to store way more than other plants do in terms of storage. The stems store tons of water, and they also are, for cacti, the primary site of photosynthesis, instead of in leaves, is in the stem. And so what we're seeing here, even this flat part of this kind of cactus, or obviously it's a little bit more evident that this is a stem, but this is a stem as well. We'll talk about the spines in a minute. So that's where the photosynthesis in cacti takes place. So it's a little bit different. All right, so remember a minute ago I talked about how sometimes stems act in reproduction. So there are some specialized stems that some plants have, and they are called stolons. Okay, so you can see them here. Excuse me. And so a stolon, so this plant has what we would consider a typical stem here in the middle. This is a strawberry plant. And so it allows the plant to grow upward. But it also has these stolons. And what the stolons do is these stems extend outward laterally from the plant and anchor, and then start growing another plant, a new set of roots and another stem here. And these could be severed, these stolons could be severed, and these separate plants would be able to survive. And so this is a type of asexual reproduction. This is a plant called water hyacinth. You can see it here as well. It does a similar thing. And so what this is doing is allowing the plant to asexually reproduce. So these are genetically identical to the parent plants. All right, in addition to this kind of specialized stem, which is called a stolon, there are these. Now, this is also a type of stolon, but it's even a modification of a modified stem, where at the end of the stolon, these carbohydrate storage structures are located that are called tubers. And so they extend out laterally from the plant, although they can be a lot, not just along the soil, but actually deeper into the soil, but it's still a stem. And so it doesn't function like a root because it doesn't function in water absorption. It's just to store carbohydrates. Some examples of tubers that you might know are ginger, and then also potatoes. So that's why when a potato, when you leave it for a long time, it'll start to grow roots, is because it is the stem. And then it'll also form what we sometimes call eyes, and that's where it's starting to kind of grow out these leaflets to make a plant. So those are modified stems or tubers. All right, so the other organ of the plant are leaves. And you can see here there's a huge amount of variety in the shapes, arrangement, and just the kind of appearance of leaves. You can see they vary quite a bit. And that's just because they evolved to whatever is the biggest advantage in their ecosystem. But overall, all leaves are going to have a structure that's referred to as a blade, which is the flat portion that is going to be functioning to bring in that light for photosynthesis. And then they're going to be attached to the stem through the structure called a petiole. So that's kind of, like I said, there's a lot of different modifications to these, but overall, the macro, the larger structure of the leaf, has a blade and a petiole. Now, going into the more micro, the microscopic level of the leaf, so we'll review some stuff we've talked about and then add a little bit today. So this is actually an amoeba sisters that I've kind of broken into pieces. So if you were to take this little piece of a leaf and look at it as a cross section, and we've seen a picture that looks like this before, what we're going to see is at the very top is going to be this cuticle, that waxy layer that's protective in order to help the water stay within the plant. And that is secreted by these epidermal cells. And so you'll see the epidermal cells along the top and bottom of the leaf. And like I said, they're going to be helping to keep that water inside. At the same time, we know that in addition to water being necessary, there are gases that are necessary for photosynthesis. And so we're going to produce gases and we're going to release gases. And so there are these specialized cells called guard cells at the bottom surface of the leaf, and they're going to be able to form this opening called a stoma. Stomata is just plural, and that's going to be the location where gases can be exchanged and that water can escape as well through transpiration. All right, now this is that same thing. It's just not quite as comic-y. So here's that cuticle, upper epidermis, dermal tissue, lower epidermis. But what's new for us today that we haven't really talked about at all are these cells in the middle. Now remember, the whole point of the leaf is photosynthesis. It's to carry out that process. And so what you're going to see in the cells that are here, all of these cells, remember, the dermal cells are not carrying out a whole lot of photosynthesis. They're secreting that cuticle. They're doing their job. But in here, you're going to have cells that have a whole big old bunch of chloroplasts, because that's where photosynthesis is going to take place. And so not all of the cells of the plant have the same amount of chloroplasts. In fact, like root cells don't have any at all, or if they do, it's very few. But these have the most. And so these are called mesophyll cells, meso. And so that prefix meso conveniently means middle. So they're in the middle section of the leaf. And there's two general types of mesophyll cells, what are called palisade and what are called spongy. And it has to do with their function. So always, 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 in all science really, biology included, structure and function are going to be tied together. So the palisade mesophyll are going to be the ones that are closest to the upper surface of the leaf. And one of the things you'll notice is they are packed in as tightly as structurally possible. So the more cells that can be exposed to that light, the more photosynthesis can take place. And so they're going to be packed in as tightly as possible. And they have more chloroplasts than any of the other cells. Now, these that are a little bit lower down are in what's called the spongy mesophyll. So the sponge, think about a sponge has those holes in it. And remember, in order for photosynthesis to take place, we don't just need sunlight, but we need water and carbon dioxide, and we're going to produce oxygen. So what you'll see here is these kind of spaces in the spongy mesophyll are where the gases are kind of moving around in this space. Now, these cells do still have chloroplasts. There is still photosynthesis taking place in them because they are getting some light exposure. But it's kind of the area where the rest of the business is going on. So you're going to see here's our vascular tissue where our xylem is bringing water into this space for photosynthesis. Some of that water is going to be lost through transpiration, but that's good. It's going to create that vacuum to pull the water up through the plant. Again, the stomata are here for the plant to get carbon dioxide and get rid of oxygen. And then you have the phloem here. So as the carbohydrates are produced, they can move into the phloem and move out to the rest of the plant. Okay? So this is probably the part that's the most technical and new as far as leaves go. So you might want to let that kind of marinate and think through it and hopefully logically make sense of it. So here is what we just talked about, but in that nice little Amoeba Sisters animation. So here's our palisade mesophyll with our light capturing plant cells. And then here in the spongy mesophyll, we've got that space in there and that vascular tissue that's going to function in bringing in the water and taking out the glucose. So all of this allows for that leaf to do its job, which is to carry out photosynthesis. All right, so just like in stems, there are some specialized leaves. And again, we could go into this a great deal, but here are just a few examples of some adaptations that some plants have to their leaves. Lily pads are an example of this. They are not like typical leaves. And I think you're probably aware of that, and that's obviously based on their environment. In gymnosperms, we have these needles, and these are a type of leaf, and so they're able to withstand a lot of different conditions than the leaves that have that flat structure. And then, again, with cacti, we saw this exact picture a minute ago. This is actually a picture that I took in Big Bend. This is the Rio Grande out here. But these kind of paddle shapes are actually the stem of the cactus, and the spines are a adapted leaf structure. And so in the case of the cacti, the leaf actually isn't where photosynthesis is taking place, as we mentioned before, but this modified structure is protecting the plant and allowing it to continue to carry out photosynthesis. So I know there was a lot in this presentation. In the next video, we'll talk about reproduction, and then that will kind of round out plants. So I hope you guys are doing well. I miss you, and take care of yourself.